right, I think we can go ahead and get started here. You lucky people, you get me twice in a row. That's almost more Pongracic than anyone can handle. I guess we'll test it. See exactly how much Pongracic you can handle. All right, so this lecture here is going to be on the Austrian business cycle theory, but I want to actually take a slightly broader approach and talk about different kinds of business cycle theories, all right? So let me just start off with some basic comments here. First of all, what we mean by the business cycle is just a cyclical movement of growth and shrinking patterns in the economy, right? That's a historical fact. We always have these, as long as we've kept track of these things, they've existed. So inevitably what happens is that we see periods of growth, right, or expansion that are inevitably followed by periods of recession, where growth disappears, maybe the economy is even shrinking, so we have negative growth rates, right? The economy is producing fewer goods and services than it did previously. And over the past 50 years or so in the US, on average, expansions lasted about 5 to 6 years, and recessions lasted about 9 to 12 months on average, okay? So that's the kind of pattern that we see. Clearly, recessions are very unpleasant. They're marked by high unemployment rates, okay, declining incomes of a large segment of the society, bankruptcies of many businesses. They are something to be avoided, right? We do not want recessions. Recessions are not fun. So exactly how do we do that? And the most important debate in the economic world, I would say for at least the last 80 years, has been on this issue. And the debate has really been one of, is the business cycle the natural result of capitalism and therefore inherent in the capitalist system, in the market process, right? Or is it due to the government interventions or policy errors by the government? Right, that's the important debate that we've seen. Is it inherent to capitalism or is it due to government interventions? Now, the most popular business cycle theory, basically dominating all others since at least the 1940s, is which one? The Keynesian business cycle theory, right? Keynes came up with it in his well-known 1936 book called The General Theory. Okay, and he really came up with a very different way of thinking about economics. One could say revolutionized economics. He basically in that book created macroeconomics, which is this idea that we can reject methodological individualism. We don't have to be looking at individual behavior. We can look at these aggregate variables and look at the relationships between aggregate variables, and we're going to be able to understand what's happening in the economy. So it's basically rejecting the previous 150 plus years of modern economics, going back to Adam Smith, all of which relied on methodological individualism. Keynes was quite aware of what he was doing in that regard, and he would call that economics classical economics. So basically anything that came before him, he referred to as classical economics, which he clearly meant pejoratively, like, oh, you know, those knuckleheads that didn't understand this wisdom that I'm now revealing, right? You know, what he was doing was modern economics. And people bought it, unbelievably enough, actually. You know, that became, Keynesian economics came to be known as new economics and just completely dominated the economic world, the world of economists, for sure, for the next basically 40 years or so. Okay? And unfortunately, the policy world still dominates there. But the way that Keynes explained the business cycle, it was really simple, where, you know, almost anybody could understand it. Now, of course, that doesn't mean it was right, but you didn't have to think very hard about it. And that, you know, this is very important because, of course, in politics, we have a great deal of what? Huh? No, I can't hear you. So, well, yeah, but what marks voters in particular? How would we describe most voters?
Dumb.
No, not dumb. Rationally ignorant, right? Remember that phrase? Rationally ignorant means that they are not, they don't pay much attention because, of course, it takes time and efforts to become educated on these things. And the likelihood of your one vote making any kind of difference is almost insignificant. So most voters say, this time that I have, scarce time, will be much more useful if I devote it to doing almost anything else but reading about politics. Okay? So they tend to be very rationally ignorant. It's rational because they're looking at benefits versus costs. And they're making the right decision. All right? The problem, of course, is that you have a lot of voters that don't have a clue, which is the problem with democracy. Right? And that's why you do not want to have a democracy. You want to have a what? A constitutional republic that limits what is up for vote. Right? Because voters will not cast good votes. I mean, that's one thing we can be sure of. You know, you don't have to look at political history very far to be convinced of this fact. All right? So when voters do not cast good votes, you actually want to limit the amount, what is up for voting, basically. Right? And that's the very important argument behind limited government. But here's why politicians actually love Keynesian stuff, because they can quickly explain it to people, and even though it's dead wrong, people say, oh yeah, that makes sense, right? And they will not bother to think about it further, deeper. They were not going to bother to look into it, to study it, right? It's plausible enough that they'll buy into it quickly. And it's all, this entire theory is about this. What is this? Aggregate demand. Aggregate demand is the deus ex machina in the Keynesian world, right? God outside of the machine. It drives everything. And this is basically what's captured in the GDP, which is why Austrians really hate the concept of the GDP. Because the GDP is not what matters about the economy. Okay, that's a different issue. Just thought I'd throw that out. You can look into that yourselves if you're interested. But the aggregate demand basically consists of these three components. C stands for personal consumption. All right, so this is households spending money on whatever they want. I stands for private investment. So this is basically done by businesses when they build new factories or buy new capital, machines and things like that, right? It's also done by private households when they buy houses or build houses, in fact. Doesn't count the existing houses. And what's G?
Government.
What? Government spending. That's right. So government spending, and the way it usually breaks down is that C is usually about, traditionally it's been about 75%. I has traditionally been about 5 to 7, sometimes 10% of the GDP. And G has been about 18%, at least in the US, all right? So here's how Keynes explains why there are business cycles. In fact, why there is a recession. He thinks, growth is normal. What we have to explain is why there are these recessions. And he basically says that it's all due to one particular characteristic of investors, of businessmen. Okay? What is that characteristic? Anybody know? They are driven by what? Nope. Animal spirits. How many of you heard that phrase before? Most of you. Animal spirits. And to Keynes, animal spirits is basically the sort of irrationality, herd-like behavior, right? So he thinks that investors and businessmen are prone to irrational bouts of optimism, sometimes pessimism. Nail this down. Okay, so these irrational bouts of optimism and pessimism, and that's just the way they are. And that's the cause of all of our problems. Here's what's going to happen. If they become irrationally pessimistic, I goes down. They stop spending as much on investment, right? But if they're not spending as much as on investment, that means that also all of these people that are employed by businesses are now going to lose income, lose jobs maybe, right? So what happens as a result of that?
You have to raise the G.
Well, no, you're too far ahead here.
All right.
Personal consumption is going to go down, right? And then as personal consumption goes down, now businesses are no longer getting as much income, right? This is the dreaded Keynesian multiplier, dreaded when it's going down, quite happy when it's going up. So you have a situation where instability of private investment brings about instability in personal consumption. And the private part of the economy is going to follow this downward spiral, right? Well, what's the obvious solution then? Right. Government is there to step in and counteract these irrational trends that we see due to businessmen being so dumb, right? And of course, government is so smart because it's all angels that are just, they understand how the economy works and they're going to step in to overcome these mistakes by businesses. That's the story, okay? So you can see now why when in 2008, both C and I started going down, it was very easy to say for the government actors, for the politicians, the government needs to step in to take up the slack. And today, and over the past 4 years, G has now gone up to what percentage of the GDP? No, not quite that high. The highest point was 25%. Now it's basically settled around 24%, okay? Now, the only other time in U.S. history where government expenditures were such a high percentage of the total expenditures in the economy was during World War II. Okay? We have never had a peacetime situation where the government was spending such a large percent of the GDP. Radha.
What's the Keynesian multiplier?
You know, I don't have a lot of time, so we can talk about it on our own, but I don't want to get into that. It's a mysterious thing. It doesn't exist, basically, okay? I'll just say that. Anyway, so here are a few problems with this Keynesian story. Now, it's interesting, actually, because Friedrich Hayek was a good friend of Keynes. They knew each other. Hayek was at London School of Economics, all right, in the 1930s. Keynes was at Cambridge. So they were pretty close to each other, and they were really sort of the main rivals for the hearts and minds of the graduate students, because that's who you got to get. You got to get the graduate students to write the dissertations in your particular way, right? That's how ideas are promulgated through the economic profession. And Hayek actually went after Keynes all through the 1930s, and he thought the Keynes was just, they liked each other, but he thought that Keynes was just out to lunch most of the time, right? And he had no idea what he was talking about. And he actually wrote really strong critiques of several books and articles that Keynes wrote in the early and mid-30s. And each time, Keynes was just basically, after those critiques, he would say, "Oh, I didn't really mean it. I was just kidding." And Hayek started getting really frustrated. And he failed to write a critique of general theory. He thought, well, this is a completely ridiculous book. Nobody's going to buy any of this, right? And he actually wrote in his, he had this series of interviews where he talked about his life towards the end of his life. And there's a great book called Hayek on Hayek, where it builds on all of that, a lot of his interviews. And he says that that's one of his main regrets, is that he never actually went after the general theory. And the general theory just exploded. And all of these graduate students said, yes, we can write dissertations on this stuff. Now Hayek started critiquing it, but too late. It got a foothold, right? And he was critiquing it from the outside. He was always the outsider. And therefore, all of the proponents of this stuff could dismiss him, like, oh, he just doesn't get it, right? He doesn't really understand the sheer brilliance of it, right? The internal logic of it. So he was basically dismissed. By the 1940s, Hayek's critiques of the Keynesian model did not matter. But by the early 1950s, there was another guy that came on the scene whose critiques very much did matter. Who was that? Milton Friedman. Now, Milton Friedman, what was different about him is that he was basically a Keynesian economist. Oh, what? He was. I mean, he basically bought into the entire aggregate way of looking at the economy. And nobody could accuse him of not understanding the Keynesian way of thinking. You see, because that was his way of thinking. So within the Keynesian paradigm, Friedman actually, over a period of about 15 years, starting in the early 1950s, going into late 1960s, he just dismantled the Keynesian model from within, like one bit by after another. And he would just grab hold of something in like a pit bull. He would not let go until it was disattached, okay, and gone, until the limb was no longer there. And the first critique, actually these are not necessarily in chronological order, but a few of his critiques. One is what came to be known as crowding out. So Friedman points out that Keynesians are engaging in a free lunch fallacy. This idea that government can actually independently increase its expenditures without affecting anything else that's going to happen here, right? That we basically get a free lunch. Now, Keynes understood that government cannot spend more by running up taxes, because increased taxes are going to have a negative impact on C and I. So if the government raises taxes to fund increased spending, it's just going to drive C plus I down. So Keynes was a major proponent of deficit spending. Prior to Keynes, nobody believed in deficit spending for any kind of lengthy period of time. After Keynes, it became the mantra of modern government, right? It's all about deficit spending. So what that means is that the government has to borrow the money, right? Well, where's the borrowed money going to come from? Well, Friedman pointed out, households. Okay, and if you have households buying government bonds, what does that mean? What's the implication of that? They're going to have less money to spend. So C will still go down. And in fact, you can take this a little bit further even. What will happen is that if you look at the loanable funds market, so this is the money that's available to be borrowed, to be loaned out, right? If you have now the government demanding a lot of these loanable funds, which of course is what it does when it issues bonds, right? It's asking to borrow money. And if people lend them that money, if there is an increase in demand, what's the price of loanable funds in that model? Nobody has that background in economics. So in the loanable funds model, supply and demand of loanable funds, what's the price on the vertical axis? The interest rate, right? So if the demand goes up, what's going to happen? The interest rate is going to go up, right? And that higher interest rate is then going to make it more difficult for consumers and businesses to borrow, more costly. So that high interest rate is actually going to drive down consumer spending also in addition because of higher interest rates. So this is crowding out. And I think we do observe crowding out quite often. It's kind of hard to make the case for that today because the interest rates are so low. But it's going to happen. We are heading towards that point. But that was one critique. Another critique is that of Friedman's theoretical critique. He said, look, let's look at the timing issues involved in this. All right? So The fact is that we do not know exactly when we enter recession. We have to look at the economic data, and you can suspect, you can look around you and say, things are not looking very good. But you've actually got to collect the data. Data takes a while to collect. It's going to take at least a couple of months before you have good data. Once you have good data, you can see that there is a downturn in the economy, but is it just a blip on the radar, or is it actually a permanent downturn, or more permanent downturn, I should say? We don't know, right? Do you want the government to act for every blip? Probably not. It would be highly destabilizing. So the government has to actually allow certain time to pass before it acts. But once it's actually sure that we are now in something more serious, more permanent, then is a matter of a democratic process. All of these things have to be debated, right? They have to be debated in Congress. How well has Congress been working lately? It's not. Well, actually, that's my definition of Congress working, is when they do nothing. I would happily pay them to do less. Okay, let's raise those salaries. The fewer laws you pass, the more we'll pay you. I think that would be a really good way to run government. Nevertheless, clearly, under the best of circumstances, it's going to take some time before the legislature figures out exactly what they're going to spend money on. Because, of course, they have to decide that. What are they going to spend money on? And then, of course, there is the lag of spending that money. And no matter how committed they are to spending money, it's going to take them a while. The early 2008 fiscal stimulus that Obama passed, early 2009, there we go, fiscal stimulus, I believe has still not been spent in its entirety. So it was almost $900 billion, all right? To spend the majority of that, it took them like 2.5 years. What's the average length of a recession? What did I say? 9 to 12 months. How long will it be before there is actual impact of government fiscal spending, fiscal stimulus? Friedman estimated if you add up all of these lags, collecting the data, having the legislature act, implementing this stuff, giving it a chance to actually work, under the best of circumstances, you're talking about 15 to 18 months before a fiscal stimulus, from the beginning of the recession until the fiscal stimulus actually kicks in. By that point, the recession is almost certainly going to be past. There are self-correcting forces, right, that will bring us back on the right path. So it's actually going to destabilize things. Right? That was the point that Friedman made. Because of these lag problems, things will actually be worse. Make it quick.
What about automatic stabilizers?
Nonsense. We can talk about it individually, all right? Complete and utter nonsense, because it's not about aggregate demand. The problems with the business cycle are on the supply side, not on the demand side. Automatic stabilizers say basically government gets to spend more automatically without any of this stuff working. The problem is not on the demand side. The problem is on the supply side. Okay? That's the problem with automatic stabilizers. Anyway, all right, so the third critique that Friedman had is that if you rely on monetary policy, which a lot of people started saying, he convinced the Keynesians that fiscal policy is probably not the best way to act against business cycle. So they all said, okay, we're going to use monetary policy. Let's get the central banks involved, right? Well, the only way that monetary policy can actually stimulate the economy, stimulate aggregate demand, is in the following way. They have to create inflation. And they have to create a situation where prices of goods and services are going to be rising faster than wages. Think about that. Wages are a major component of business revenues. Business costs. Okay? So most businesses spend the most money on wages. So we have to have a situation where costs are going up more slowly than revenues. Revenues going up, that's very much driven by the prices of what they're selling, right? Why do we want revenues to be going up faster than costs? That creates profits. And what do profitable businesses do?
Survive.
Well, in Keynesian, it's all about jobs. It's not about producing goods and services that consumers want. They don't care about that at all. It's all about jobs. All right, which just shows you how much of the modern debate, discussion is driven by Keynesian mindset. It's all about jobs. It's not all about jobs. It's actually about creating stuff that consumers find valuable. That's the purpose of economy, right? It's not to create jobs. Not to say that jobs are not good. We want more jobs. But that's not the end, the purpose of economic activity. Purpose of economic activity is to create stuff that will make our lives better. You see? So Keynesians will say, in order to create jobs, which is how we get out of the recession, according to them, right? We have to have profitable businesses. And what that means is that they're basically going to create a situation where wages don't adjust quite as quickly, right? Most of us have like 1-year contract or even longer contracts on our wages. So you can't adjust wages all the time, but of course you can adjust prices all the time of goods and services. So if the prices of goods and services are going up faster than wages, businesses become more profitable and they start hiring more. That's the idea behind monetary stimuli, okay? Monetary policy stimuli. But how do you feel about that? What do you think about that? So let's think about it from the perspective of a normal consumer, a normal working person. What's happening to your purchasing power? It's going down, right? Prices of goods and services are going up. Your wages are stuck. Are you better off? You are not, right? So basically the idea here is to stick it to the workers and increase the profits of businesses. That's how monetary policy is going to work. And the effect of that ultimately is inflation. Right? We get persistent inflation. And this is what Friedman warned about. He said, look, monetary policy leading to this is going to lead to persistent inflation, because what's going to start happening, if you have inflation of goods, prices of goods and services going faster than wages, people are not stupid. They're going to start anticipating those higher rates of inflation. They're going to build that into their expectations for the future. And they will demand faster and faster wage growth. So what will the central bank have to do in order to outpace the wage growth?
Just keep on increasing faster.
Yeah, they'll have to increase the prices of goods and services at a faster and faster rate to outpace the growth of wages. And that's how you get into inflationary spiral. And that's how you get into hyperinflation, right? So those were the theoretical critiques that Friedman had of Keynesianism. By the late 60s, most people had to accept these things. But what the Keynesians said was that, look, it works. Things are good. We just went to the 50s. The 60s have been good. 60s, my gosh, we had the Vietnam War. And we had good standard of living. Guns and butter, right? How can you argue with success? Well, the 70s were much less kind to the Keynesian perspective. It all started falling apart. Inflation rates started going up, and away. There we go again. And the economy started stagnating. And we got, anybody know what we got? What we call that? Stagflation, yeah. And this is something that was not supposed to happen in the Keynesian paradigm. You were not supposed to be able to have both at the same time, inflation and a stagnant or shrinking economy. So all the Keynesians went, does not compute, their heads exploded, right? The Phillips curve was overthrown. Unfortunately, don't worry about that, but if you know what I'm talking about, unfortunately, the Fed still completely adheres to the Phillips curve, this whole idea that there is a trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Yes?
And I've seen that, like, in Austrian economics, stagflation was,
The predicted outcome. Yes. All right, so the empirical, in the 70s, the empirical reality actually served to drive what we thought was the final nail in the coffin of Keynesianism. And by the way, Friedman also pointed out, so as public choice economics started becoming popular, in the 60s and 70s, you had, in fact, two of my professors, they wrote this great book called Democracy in Deficit, where they said, look, the Keynesian economics has really opened the doors to infinite deficits, right? Because now it allows the politicians to provide a scientific justification for what they want to do naturally, which is spend more, right? And now they can argue, well, the government needs to spend more because the economy is not doing as well as it could be. And the economy is never doing as well as it could be. Right? They're always saying, oh, it needs more stimulus. Things are very dangerous. Even if you're not in a recession. So as a result, over the past 60 years, I think the US has had a grand total of 3 years where we had a budget surplus. And most of that time was actually economic growth, right? Most of the past 60 years were not a time of a recession. And yet the government was still running these deficits. Keynes was incredibly naive about how politics works. He thought that responsible angel-like politicians would only run deficits during the recessionary periods, and then during the expansionary periods, they would run surpluses that would allow them to pay down the debt. And the debt would be, the budget would be balanced over the business cycle, you see? So that was the Keynesian perspective. So we saw theoretical problems with it. We saw empirical problems with it, political problems with it. And we all thought, all right, Keynesianism is dead by the mid-70s, late 70s. Let's move on. Now, it was replaced by free market economics of the new classical variety. But these new classicals were nuts, all in their own way, okay? These guys, they were all enamored by mathematical models, and it all had to be shown in a mathematical model. And they went completely in the opposite direction for Keynesianism, where you had irrational businessmen. And these new classical free market economists, they said, oh, people are always perfectly rational. That people are like supercomputers. They have perfect information, they know exactly what's going on, and they know exactly how they're going to maximize their utility. How do you explain business cycles in that kind of a world? The answer, you don't. Right? So they came up with this real business cycle theory, which they said, well, business cycles happen because there are these exogenous shocks. Something happens from the outside, disturbs things, and then things are a little messy for a while until rational economic agents again adjust, and we're back to having a great economy. And then finally, when they realized, this really doesn't explain almost anything, they just abandoned it all. And through the 80s and 90s, there was basically no research done on the business cycles. Everybody's like, we don't have to worry about it. That's in the past, really. Yeah, occasionally you're going to get these bumps, but it's not a big deal. We're going to do something else, right? Something more interesting. Well, then, of course, 2008 happens, and we revert back to simple-headed Keynesian economics, and everybody's shocked. The economic profession itself, we thought we had rejected all that stuff. We were done with it. And all of a sudden, different vampire movies, where Dracula keeps coming back from, being completely dead. Not just mostly dead, completely dead, right? At the end of one movie. And lo and behold, the next movie, he's alive again, right? So Keynesian economics is like Dracula economics. You just can't kill the damn thing. No matter how many stakes you run through its heart, in the next episode, it's alive and more evil than ever. So we get this Keynesian economics in 2008 coming back with vengeance. And it's a shock to everybody. The policymakers certainly very much adhere to it, and they say, this is what we need to do. We need to spend a lot more. We get all of that spending, right? And a lot of people start saying, this is crazy. This is complete lunacy. We've got to find an alternative to all this. Well, where are the alternatives? The new classical economists of the 70s and 80s, they did not provide any alternatives. Who did provide an alternative? Mises and Hayek. All right? So you see this large-scale rediscovery of what came to be known as the Austrian business cycle theory. Now, let's talk about that. All right, the Austrian business cycle theory, how much time am I doing on that? Okay. The Austrian business cycle theory was started by Mises in his first book, Theory of Money and Credit, in 1912. And it was really so he developed it further, but Hayek actually developed it much more in a series of very complex and very insightful articles in the 1930s, basically ending in around 1941. So the majority of what came to be known as the Austrian business cycle theory came about between 1912 and 1941. By 1941, nobody cared about Austrian business cycle theory. It was completely beaten by Keynesianism. But you had this small group of people, the Austrian economists, that did start getting interested, especially in the 1970s into the 1980s. And they started rediscovering all these ideas. So the Austrian business cycle theory actually did provide an alternative. And it's an alternative that's much deeper and much more complex in explanation than Keynesianism. You cannot explain necessarily the Austrian business cycle theory in like 2 sentences to somebody that's not very economically sophisticated, like you can with Keynesianism, right? And that's the problem. But we started seeing so many more people getting interested in it. So let's look at what the aspects of Austrian business cycle theory are. 2 notable aspects of the Austrian business cycle theory. For one thing, it incorporates capital. I mean, imagine that, right? We are talking about this system that we call what? Capitalism. Is there any capital? I mean, there's a little bit in private investment, but not in any sort of a real sense. Capital is just like this blob, homogeneous blob of stuff, right? And all that matters is how much people spend on that blob. Okay, I like that. I need to remember that. It's the blob theory of economics. Okay, going into all sorts of different movies. Dracula, blob. Anyway, so it's got capital, and it also it incorporates what Austrians call the structure of production. And structure of production is very much tied to capital, but it's this idea that production takes time. It's, remember this word, use it to impress your friends, okay? Intertemporal, right? It happens over time. It's not instantaneous. And there's no time in any of these theories. There's no time in Keynesian theory. There's no time in new classical theories of business cycles. They basically they're instantaneous. They have no recognition that time matters at all. Time very much matters in the Austrian story, okay? So here's the nutshell of the Austrian story, and then I will explain it in more detail. So let's go through these 4 steps, and this is the Austrian business cycle theory, all right? So it always starts off with some sort of artificial money or credit expansion. Artificial money or credit expansion. Money or credit is the same thing. It's whatever banks have available to be loaned out, right? How does that happen? How do you get artificial money or credit expansion?
Printing money.
Yeah, you print money. You have the central bank behind that. Okay? So the central bank somehow expands the money supply and credit supply. Why would it do that, by the way? What's it hoping to accomplish? Provide a stimulus to the economy, right? That's always the justification behind it, that the economy requires some sort of monetary stimulus, and this is going to do it. Okay, the next step is that artificial credit expansion leads to price and interest rate distortions. Remember what we talked about again yesterday, that the price system is extremely important as a what? Huh? Okay, calculation. What did you say? Or I thought somebody said, I heard. A signal, right? To whom? Well, even more importantly, entrepreneurs. That's right. Entrepreneurs are completely reliant on the price system, on the guidance, the compass of the price system. And if you start messing with the compass, right? If you start attaching magnets to it, watch out. you're going to end up badly lost and probably dead. Okay? To push the analogy a little far. So, if you're in the wilderness or in a wide open ocean, if you start messing with the compass, you're going to end up in a world of hurt. And in particular, what's going to happen is that the interest rates are going to be distorted. Now, interest rates they're a price. Okay, they're just a price. They're a price of what? Yeah, earlier availability of funds, basically. Early availability of funds, right? So it's actually the most important price in the economy because it affects every market. Whereas all the other prices tend to just affect their own market. Interest rate is the price that affects every market. So we have a situation where a central bank is messing with the most important price in the entire economy. Okay? As a result of those interest rate distortions in particular, we end up with malinvestments. What's a malinvestment? A bad investment. That's right. A wrong investment. Something that's actually not supposed to be done and that's going to inevitably turn out badly. Right? And that's actually during this part we have this boom. Inevitably, after the boom, there will come a bust which will clear out all of these malinvestments. Now let me spell this out a little bit more in detail, okay? Let's see how this works. So let me actually close the door. It's getting a little loud. Okay, so the way that there's artificial money and credit expansion that happens is that the central bank is going to go usually to banks. In the US, there are these particular dealer banks, and it's going to buy what from those banks? Government bonds in particular. Most recently, it's been buying all sorts of things. But through almost the entire history of the Fed, it would only buy government bonds. Notice, the Federal Reserve is a different institution, separate from the federal government. Okay? It's an institution created by the federal government, but it's not part of the budget of the federal government. And it has nothing to do with the issuing of treasury bonds, of government bonds. So the government decides to issue bonds. And it's actually illegal for the Federal Reserve to buy bonds directly from the government. But they didn't say anything about buying those bonds indirectly. So what will happen is that banks will hold a lot of different financial instruments. Many of those instruments that they hold are government bonds. So the Fed comes in, and this is the way it works in every country around the world, right? The central bank comes in, buys up a whole bunch of government bonds from the bank. What does the bank now have? By the way, where did the central bank get the money with which they buy these bonds? Created out of thin air. They printed it, or you don't even have to print it today. It's just electronic. It's all on the computer, right? They don't actually have to go through the process of printing, because every private bank has a big account at the Federal Reserve. So what they do is they simply buy up these bonds and they increase how much money the bank has at the Federal Reserve. It's just it's a computer transaction. Okay? What do banks find themselves with more of at this point? Money to loan out. That's right, loanable funds. That was not money that they could loan out before. They had bonds. You can't loan out bonds, right? But now they have money that they can loan out. So the Federal Reserve or any central bank, they can artificially increase credit and money by buying up these bonds or whatever else they want to buy up from the banks. Banks find themselves having more money, and they start loaning out this money. But of course, they can't force people to borrow money. What will they have to do? They will have to lower the interest rates in order to make it more attractive for businesses and households to borrow. Okay? So in effect, what's happening is that in the loanable funds market, you've got supply and demand of loanable funds. Who are the suppliers of, from your perspective, okay? So here's the demand, here's the supply, okay? Who are the suppliers of loanable funds?
Banks, loan insurance.
No, absolutely not. Who are the real suppliers of loanable funds?
Everyone who has an account at the bank.
Sorry?
All of us who have bank accounts.
Yeah, what do we call those people? Savers. Right? That's the point here, is that the supply of loanable funds has to come from savers. The demand for loanable funds comes from who? Borrowers, right? Whether businesses or households. The point is that banks are just the intermediaries. They bring the savers and borrowers together. They are not the suppliers of loanable funds. It's not their money, right? It's the money of all of us that have deposited it at the bank. So the way that Mises explained it is that the interest rate, therefore, shows this balance between saving and borrowing. It's an important signal because it actually demonstrates how much households want to consume versus save. That's very important. Think about that. So what the supply of savings is determines basically, okay, well, if households are saving more, they can't consume as much, right? What in effect, what they're saying is that we don't want as much consumption now. We want consumption when? In the future, right? We want consumption later. More consumption because they're going to get paid an interest for their saving. So that's what that's the signal, the information that's contained in the interest rate, right? Now, the Fed or any central bank gets involved and they start messing with the supply. They massively expand the supply of loanable funds. What will happen? The interest rate goes down. What's the signal that entrepreneurs now are getting?
More investments, more riskier investments.
Yeah, and what they're actually also being told is that consumers don't want to consume as much consumption goods right now. They don't want to consume. That means that there are now going to be more funds, that there's going to be more resources to engage in production of capital goods. Now here's where the structure of production comes in. You can think of structure of production, how long between making an investment and having the consumption good of that investment. Now you can have very short structure of production where it's like you're Robinson Crusoe and you've got like, I don't know, a knife, right? And you have to make everything with that knife. Right? The structure of production is almost non-existent. You go from the investment straight to the consumer good. Structure of production grows if Robinson Crusoe first makes a tool. Right? So he makes some kind of a pole that's going to allow him to knock down coconuts. Right? Structure of production has now been lengthened. Or if he makes a net, right? In each case, the period between the investment and the consumption good is growing. It's lengthening. You say, well, why would you want to do that? Why would Robinson Crusoe want to do that?
To access harder to find goods. There's be new demand
Well,
for
to
it.
make himself more productive, right? By having access to these capital goods, to the net and to the pole, right? He's going to be able to get a lot more fish and a lot more coconuts. But notice that for a while, he's not going to be able to produce consumer goods, right? While he's making a net, while he's making a pole, he can't actually be fishing or getting coconuts. So there has to be some period of saving, in effect, where he is not being able to produce. When interest rates are going down, entrepreneurs are told, now's the time to invest in capital goods. Capital goods are good. They're going to make you more productive. Under most circumstances, there is not enough saving to satisfy all these production of all these capital goods. But now there are the resources. We don't have to use the resources to produce consumer goods. Those resources can now be devoted to producing capital goods. That's the signal that entrepreneurs are getting. They're going to start producing more capital goods. Here's a problem. Are consumers actually stopping consumption, slowing down on consumption? They're not. Because the lowering of the interest rate is a result of what? Artificial credit expansion rather than consumer choices. And as a result of that artificial credit expansion and lower interest rates, entrepreneurs are now devoting more and more resources to production of capital, which takes time. Production of capital, you can think of like building houses. They're looking at all of this, they're saying, okay, consumers are now want to buy more houses. So they start building more houses. Meanwhile, and by the way, so think about what's happening in the economy during that part. We have all of these capital investment projects that require more workers. Workers are getting hired left and right. In fact, there is competition now for workers, which leads to what? More competition for workers, which leads to what? Higher wages, higher income for workers. Everybody's loving it, right? This is the boom part of the cycle, because we have a lot of malinvestments. You see, I have another 5 minutes or so. So these malinvestments are now creating a situation where incomes are going up. Everybody's thinking, now this is what I call a good economy, right? Yeah, can you close that, please? Keynesians are trying to sabotage us. Say, all right, we shall not let this stand. Okay, where are other open windows here? Okay. That helps a little bit. All right, so these malinvestments now, notice the problem is that they are not sustainable. There are simply not enough resources being scarce, in a society to be able to continue producing all of the same amount of consumer goods and complete all of the investments in capital goods. You follow what I'm saying? And at some point, that disconnect between all the different projects that have been undertaken and the scarcity of resources starts becoming obvious. That's when things start getting ugly, right? All of the investments that have been undertaken in capital goods, the entrepreneurs now start realizing, because what's happening is that there is a bidding up of the prices of these capital goods, right? All of these different businesses, both in capital goods and in consumer goods, are now trying to get more resources for themselves to be able to complete all of their projects. And there's just not enough. So their prices are going up, and pretty soon some of these, certainly capital investment projects, start being revealed as being unprofitable. Given the high cost of resources, there's no way to carry out these investment projects to their end and have them be profitable. Once that horrific realization sets in, what will entrepreneurs do? Abandon these projects. They're going to stop, right? What's the result of that?
Jobs.
Unemployment, right? So there is first this inflationary period, right? As the boom is accelerating, inflation's going up. You have resource costs going up, and with that, the prices of goods and services going up. Once we have the turning down, the bust part coming in, now we're going to actually start getting deflationary pressures, where prices are going down. Let me just wrap this up, okay? And the unfortunate outcome, of course, is that now we have massive layoffs, high rates of unemployment, economy slowing down, and in turn, think about, this is also what Keynes talked about, that all of these households now that had large incomes prior to the bust, while the boom was going on, they lose their incomes. They can't afford to buy as much consumer goods. So all of these producers of consumer goods start feeling the pain as well, right? And some of them are going to go out of business themselves. So it's this downward spiral at that point. But notice, the problem is not the bust. The problem is not the recession. The recession, the bust part, is just the clearing out of the bad investments, the investments that should not have taken place in the first place, right? That should not have been undertaken in the first place. The problem is the artificial boom which is entirely the result of government interventions. Now, it's really difficult to actually look at the previous 10 years, 12 years, and say that's not what happened. Because the Federal Reserve actually, by 2000 and, let me think about this, by 2003, it had driven this key interest rate, the Fed funds rate, to its historically record lows of 1%, and it kept them there for a year and a half. Interest rates were so low due to entirely to incredibly stimulative Federal Reserve policy. But the recession of 2001 that triggered all of this had come to an end by the end of 2001. What did the Fed keep doing? They kept lowering the interest rates further and further and further until 2003, kept it at that level, and for, like I said, for a year and a half, and then only gradually started raising the interest rate. So you had the situation where mortgage rates were unbelievably low, like 5%. If you were, doing these teaser rates, you could actually even have it for lower than that for a year or two, right? So people started investing in massive amounts of money, all of this false, artificial created spending. They all thought it was going to last forever. It was a bubble that was created by the Federal Reserve policy. Once the bubble popped, the party was over, right? This is actually, a lot of people call the Austrian business cycle theory the hangover theory, right? Because it's akin to abuse of alcohol or drugs. It's the same thing, right? I mean, think about somebody that, I don't know, let's go with cocaine, because it's a fun thing to do, right? This is a reference actually to a Colbert report where he had this congressman that he actually got to say, said, will you repeat after me? I do cocaine because it's a fun thing to do. Right, and this congressman actually went ahead and said it. So anyway, if you ingest a whole bunch of cocaine, right, you're flying high. You're feeling good for quite a while, probably 12, whatever. I don't know, have no personal experience with it, but you're going to be feeling very good for a matter of some hours. Where's the problem? The problem is when the effects wear off, right? You're going to crash. And it's going to be painful. And probably some of you have that experience with alcohol, right? It's all good while you're partying. The next morning, you're bowing down to the great porcelain god, right? And cursing your very existence. And then the next night, you do it again, right? That's the kind of monetary policy that we have today. It's like we have frat guys running our monetary policy, right? I mean, the insanity of it is just unbelievable. And notice that the implication of all of this is that if the Federal Reserve then intervenes during the period of the bust, right, as we're trying to cleanse out the malinvestments, as we're trying to figure out which investments are actually good and which ones are bad, and let's get those bad ones out of there so we can start growing again, right? The central bank will intervene again, start distorting the interest rates further, making the entire adjustment process even more difficult. It's sort of like the hair of the dog, if you're aware of this, right? If you had too much to drink the night before and you wake up in a world of hurt, a good way to get over it is to just start drinking, okay? This is Lemmy of Motorhead, who I dearly love. He's a very cool guy. And they asked him, why don't you ever seem to show any effects of alcohol? He said, because I never stopped drinking. Okay? That's the Federal Reserve policy right now. We're trying to actually not stop drinking. Okay? Yes, make it quick.
There's like the music video those people made, It's High Like Canes,
yes.
That thing, and they reference the hair of the dog and the hangover theory.
Absolutely right, because that's, it's a very big part of this Austrian explanation. I cannot recommend these videos highly enough, by the way. There are two of them, Hayek versus Keynes videos, all right? And it's the Austrian business cycle theory versus the Keynesian theory of the business cycle. So anyway, let me just wrap this up because I'm out of time. Let's see if I had any final words here. So, it's very important to understand that the problem is not with the bust, right? the problem was with the boom. It's the boom that we want to avoid in the first place. That's something that a lot of people don't understand. And the boom is, of course, when everybody is really happy, when the party is raging. That's what we have to avoid. And the only way to avoid that, really, is to not give the power to manipulate the money supply to a central bank. So the solution that Austrians will have is that this problem is that we have to basically avoid having monetary policy. And that means really getting rid of a central bank. Central banks have been incredibly destructive institutions. And I'll just end with this. Even when you look at the US history, so we're coming up next year on a very unhappy anniversary, which is 100 years since the creation of the Federal Reserve, right? It actually started operating in 1914. It was created in 1913. And if you look at the history of the Fed, it's a complete disaster. And it's not, again, just me nutty Austrians saying that, right? I'll give you two pieces of evidence for this. Can I take a few extra minutes? Is that okay? Okay, thank you. First, the same money and banking book that I mentioned before, it's written by Frederick Mishkin. Mishkin was a Federal Reserve governor until a couple of years ago. And he was one of the people responsible for the policy of the mid-decade stuff the Fed was doing. He's got a chapter on the history of Federal Reserve policy in this textbook. And the opening sentence of that chapter reads, "The old adage, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, can just as well be applied to Fed policy as anything else." Right? He could have changed that. He's had many different editions of this textbook since he was a Fed governor. It's still in there, even in the most recent edition. Okay? So he clearly understands. I mean, he goes through and chronicles one major error after another. And here's the coup d'etat, the big one. All right? So there is our friend Ben Bernanke, the Bernanke. All right? And the Bernanke, he's been the chairman since, 2006, I think it was. He was made chairman of the Fed in 2006. Prior to that, he was a governor, okay? Governor of the Fed. And there are 7 governors. Chairman is the chairman of the board of governors, okay? And so in 2003, I believe, there was a massive bash celebrating Milton Friedman's 90th birthday, okay? Thanks. So Milton Friedman, one of his major contributions that I did not talk about here, is this book with a woman by the name of Anna Schwartz, who just passed away about 2 weeks ago. I think she was 98 or something. She was still working for NBER, National Bureau of Economic Research. She's awesome. Anna Schwartz and Milton Friedman wrote this book called The Monetary History of the United States. Okay? And in there, it came out, in 1962. In there, they made the claim and explained it that the Federal Reserve is to be blamed for the Great Depression. All right, and I think Bob Higgs is going to be talking about that tomorrow, so I'm not going to get into all of that. But the Bernanke was the representative of the Federal Reserve at this event. And what people were doing, they were looking at different contributions that Friedman made throughout his life. Bernanke was dealing with this particular contribution, his critique of the Fed, and he was the representative of the Fed there, right? And that was actually his area of expertise as well. So he goes through all of the evidence, whether the Fed was responsible for the Great Depression, looks at it all, and here are his exact words at the end. He says, so to Milton and Anna, and Anna Schwartz was there as well. So to Milton and Anna, I say, you're right. We did it. We're very sorry. We won't do it again. Think about that. A representative of the Fed, the current Fed chairman, admitted that the Federal Reserve was behind the Great Depression, was responsible for the Great Depression. Okay? How many Americans are aware of that? How many Americans blame the Federal Reserve for the Great Depression? Almost none, because they're all taught in high school It's evil capitalism that almost destroyed the great American democratic experiment, right? It's a travesty. It really is. The Fed has been just an unbelievably destructive institution. You just look at everything they've done has gone wrong. And they always say, now we know better. Next time we'll fix it. Dynamics of interventionism, anybody? Right? I think next year would be a great opportunity to just get rid of the whole thing, right? You've had your 100 years. It's time to go. Bye-bye. All right? Anyway, so thank you very much. Thank you. We can discuss this more in the discussion session.